My daughter-in-law looked me straight in the eyes at that dinner table and said, "Walter, you're becoming a problem." My son said nothing. He just looked down at his plate and let her say it. What neither of them knew was that I had been planning for that moment for 3 months. I am Walter Graves. I am 64 years old, and this is the story of how I disappeared and what I left behind when I did. I want to start with the house, because the house is where everything began and where everything ended. I built that house with my own hands. Not literally, I was a civil engineer, not a carpenter, but I designed every square foot of it. I drew the blueprints on a drafting table in my garage when my wife, Carol, was still alive. She would bring me coffee at 11 o'clock at night and look over my shoulder and say things like, "Walter, the master bedroom needs more light," and I would redraw the whole east wall just because she smiled when she said it. We broke ground in 1994. We moved in on a Tuesday in March of 1996. My son Derek was 11 years old. He ran through every room and picked the bedroom at the end of the hall because it had a window that faced the oak tree he liked to climb. Carol died in 2017. Pancreatic cancer. 4 months from diagnosis to the end. I won't spend more time on that than I need to because this story isn't about grief, even though grief is threaded through every part of it. What I will say is that after she was gone, that house was the only thing that still felt like her. The kitchen still smelled like the lavender she kept in a bowl by the window. Her handwriting was still on the inside of the pantry door, little grocery lists she'd stuck there with a thumbtack and never taken down. I couldn't leave. I didn't want to. Derek was 32 when Carol passed. He'd been married to Serena for 2 years by then. I didn't know Serena well. They dated for about 18 months before the wedding, a small ceremony in Asheville that felt more like a business arrangement than a celebration. Serena was from money. Her father owned a chain of car dealerships in the Carolinas, and she had grown up in a world where everything had a price tag and everything could be negotiated. She wasn't unkind to me in those early years. She was just distant in the way that some people are distant when they haven't decided yet what you're worth to them. After Carol died, Derek came to see me more often. He'd drive up from Charlotte on Sunday afternoons, and we'd sit on the back porch and not say very much, and that was enough. He looked like his mother around the eyes. I never told him that. I should have. Then Oliver was born in 2019. My grandson changed everything. I say that without any sentimentality, just as a plain fact. When Derek put that baby in my arms for the first time in the hospital room, something that had been frozen in my chest since Carol died started to loosen. Oliver had her hands long fingers, wide palms. I noticed it immediately. I didn't say anything because Serena was in the bed watching me with that careful expression she had, the one that meant she was calculating something. The first time Serena asked me for money, Oliver was 4 months old. It wasn't a direct request. It never was with her. She mentioned, over dinner, that they'd found a house in Myers Park, a beautiful neighborhood, she said. Very good schools, very safe, and that the mortgage would be a stretch but manageable. Derek nodded along the way he always did when Serena was talking about something she had already decided. I asked what stretch meant. Serena smiled and said they might need a little help with the down payment. Just a loan between family, she said. She used the word loan. I want to be clear about that, because she never used that word again after that first night. I gave them $80,000. I told myself it was for Oliver. I told myself a lot of things. The house in Myers Park was beautiful. 4 bedrooms, a big backyard, a kitchen that cost more than my first car. I visited once a month. Derek would make dinner, or try to, and Serena would correct him quietly while he cooked. And Oliver would crawl around the kitchen floor and pull himself up on my knee, and for a few hours things would feel almost normal. But Serena had a way of making me feel like a guest in a hotel that was just slightly out of my budget. She never said anything directly. She was too smart for that. It was smaller things. The way she would glance at my clothes. I was a work shirt and khakis man. Always had been with an expression that lasted half a second but meant everything. The way she would redirect conversations when I was in the middle of a sentence, not rudely, just efficiently. The way you change a channel. The way she would refer to the Myers Park house as our home, in a tone that made clear I was not part of the hour. I started noticing changes in Derek around the time Oliver turned 1. My son had always been quiet. Carol used to say he was still water deep and calm and hard to read, but there was a warmth underneath his quiet. He had his mother's instinct for when a room needed softening. He'd been that way his whole life. But around Oliver's first birthday, something in him started to harden. He canceled Sunday visits twice in a row, then a third time. When I called, he answered, but the conversations had a new quality to them, clipped, a little impatient, like I was taking time from something more important. I told myself he was tired. New baby, demanding job, big mortgage. I gave him room. I should not have given him room. In the spring of 2021, I sold my engineering firm. I had built Graves Civil over 22 years, starting with 2 employees in a rented office above a dry cleaner in Greensboro, and growing it to a regional firm with 41 people and contracts across 6 states. The sale price was $4.3 million, which, after taxes and the money I set aside in various accounts, Carol and I had planned together, left me with a comfortable but not extravagant retirement. I told Derek about the sale. He seemed pleased, the way people seem pleased when they hear news that doesn't directly affect them. Serena called me the following day to congratulate me. She asked, very casually, whether I had thought about my estate planning. I told her I had an attorney handling it. She said that was smart. She said family should be protected. 3 weeks later, Derek asked me to add him to my primary brokerage account just in case something happened. He said Serena had suggested it. He said it made sense at their stage of life to have visibility into assets that might eventually come to them. I remember the exact phrasing, eventually come to them. I added him. I told myself it was practical. The requests came more regularly after that. Not large ones, always that wasn't the pattern. A few thousand here for home repairs. A contribution toward a car when Serena said hers was unreliable. Enrollment fees for a private preschool for Oliver that cost $1,400 a month. Each one was framed as temporary, necessary, sensible. Each one was framed as being ultimately in Oliver's interest. And each one made me feel, for a day or two, like I was useful, like I still had a place in the architecture of their lives. What I didn't see clearly until much later was that I was being managed. Serena was intelligent. She had probably been doing this her whole life, reading people for what they needed to feel valued, and then using exactly that need to get what she wanted. What I needed was to feel like a father, like a grandfather, like someone whose presence in that house mattered. She gave me just enough of that to keep me compliant. Oliver would run to me at the door. Derek would ask my opinion on something practical, a contractor, a roofing material, something in my wheelhouse, and I would feel the old professional pleasure of being the man who knew things. And then the dinner would end, and I would drive back to the house in Greensboro alone, and the lavender smell would be fading from the kitchen, and I would sit on the back porch in the dark and feel a loneliness I couldn't quite name. My friend Frank noticed before I did. Frank Calloway had been my attorney for 20 years, and my friend for longer than that. He had handled Carol's estate, the sale of my firm, every significant legal matter in my adult life. He was 71 and retired, except for a few old clients he kept out of loyalty, and I was one of them. We played golf on Thursdays when the weather allowed. He watched me for about a year before he said anything. He said it on a Thursday in October of 2022. We were on the 7th hole, and he stopped walking and looked at me and said, "Walter, how much have you given them this year?" I said I didn't know exactly. He said, "Yes, you do." I thought about it. I said somewhere around 90,000, maybe a little more. Frank was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "And what has changed for you because of it?" I didn't have an answer. He said, "When did you last spend a full day with Oliver without Serena in the room?" I thought about it. I couldn't remember. Frank put his hand on my shoulder and said, "I'm not telling you what to do. I'm just asking you to see what's in front of you." I drove home that night, and I sat at the kitchen table, and I went through my bank statements for the previous 18 months. I am an engineer. I am trained to look at systems and identify where load is being distributed incorrectly, where a structure is bearing weight it was never designed to bear. When I laid out those statements, I saw the structure clearly for the first time. Over 18 months, I had transferred or gifted a total of $237,000 to Derek and Serena. In the same period, I had seen Oliver alone, without Serena present, without the managed quality that her presence always introduced exactly twice. I am not a man who cries easily. Carol used to tease me about it. She said I had tear ducts made of reinforced concrete. But I sat at that kitchen table in the house I had built for her, and I felt something break open in my chest, and I let it, because I was alone and no one would see. Then I dried my face, and I called Frank. We talked for 2 hours. Not about feelings. Frank and I weren't built for that kind of conversation, but about options, about what was legally mine, what was accessible to Derek through the account access I had given him, what could be changed, and how quickly. About Oliver, and what protections existed for a grandparent in the state of North Carolina, and under what circumstances a court might consider a change in arrangement. Frank had done family law early in his career. He still knew the landscape. By midnight, I had the outline of a plan. I want to be honest about something. There was a part of me, even then, that hoped I was wrong about Derek. I had raised that boy. I had coached his Little League team and driven him to SAT prep, and sat in the front row at his college graduation with a grief in my chest because Carol was not beside me. I had watched him become a man, and I had been proud of him in the quiet way that fathers are proud of sons when the son doesn't know they're being watched. I didn't want to believe that the man I raised had become someone who would allow his wife to reduce his father to a quarterly budget line. I told myself there was still time, that if I said something directly, something honest, Derek would hear me the way he used to hear me when he was young, and the world was simpler. I gave it 3 more months. I invited them for Christmas, the full week between Christmas and New Year's. The house in Greensboro, Carol's house, my house. I stocked the kitchen with everything Oliver liked. I found Carol's old ornament boxes in the attic. She had collected one ornament from every place we'd ever traveled, and the tree told the story of our whole life together. I put them all up. I wanted Derek to see it. I wanted him to remember what we were. Serena arrived and moved through the house with a quality I can only describe as assessment. She opened the kitchen cabinets. She commented on the age of the appliances. She asked, in a tone that sounded like concern but wasn't, whether I had thought about updating the place that it would hold its value better, she said. Derek said nothing. He was on his phone most of the first day. Oliver was magnificent. He was 3 years old, and the house was full of interesting things, and he wanted to touch all of them. He found Carol's lavender bowl in the kitchen and brought it to me and asked what it smelled like. I held it out for him. He inhaled seriously, the way small children do when they're concentrating, and then he smiled. It was Carol's smile exactly. I had to look away. On the 4th day, I asked Derek if we could take Oliver to the park together, just the 2 of us. Father and son, grandfather and grandson, the way it used to be. Derek looked at Serena. Serena said they'd already made plans to visit a friend of hers who lived in the area. I said we could go in the morning, just a few hours. Derek said maybe tomorrow. Tomorrow came and Serena had something else. We never went. New Year's Eve. I had made dinner pot roast, Carol's recipe, the one I'd been making since 1988. We were sitting at the table. Oliver was in his booster seat next to me, eating at the focused industriousness of toddlers. Serena was talking about a renovation she wanted to do to the Myers Park house. In addition, she said, a sunroom off the back. She mentioned a number, $280,000. There was a silence. I understand now that the silence was deliberate. She looked at me across the table and said, in the pleasant voice she used for things she had already decided, we were thinking it might be a good investment for you, Walter. Property values in that neighborhood, it would really add to the equity. You'd essentially be investing in your own future, in Oliver's future. I looked at my son. He was cutting his meat. He did not look up. I said, that's a large number, Serena. She said, it's an investment, not a cost. There's a difference. I said, I understand the difference. I built a business on the difference. Something shifted in her face then. Something that had always been underneath the pleasantness came up to the surface just briefly, just enough for me to see it. She said, Walter, we've been patient. We've been flexible. But Derek and I have built a life, and we have a child, and there comes a point where support needs to be reliable, not conditional. I said, I have never made my support conditional. She said, no, but your moods are, your visits, the way you make Derek feel guilty for having his own family. Derek put his fork down. I waited. He looked up at me, and I searched his face for the boy I knew, and I found only a man who was tired and had chosen the easier path, and he said, Dad, she's right. You have the resources. We're not asking for anything you can't spare. And honestly, The way you've been about things lately, the calls, showing up unexpectedly, the comments, it makes Serena uncomfortable. It makes me uncomfortable. I said, I am your father. He said, I know, but this is my family. The word landed like a verdict. This is my family, as if I were not part of it. As if I had been reclassified sometime in the last 3 years from family to something adjacent, something administrative, something that provided funding and was tolerated in return. I didn't say anything else that night. I helped Oliver to bed. I read him 2 books about trucks because he was obsessed with trucks that winter, and he fell asleep with his hand curled around my finger the way he had done since he was an infant, and I sat in the dark of the guest room, the room that had been Derek's room, the room with the window facing the oak tree, and I thought about what Frank and I had discussed, and I made my decision. The next morning, I drove them to their car. I hugged Oliver for a long time. He smelled like the lavender bowl and sleep and that specific warm bread smell that small children have. I told him I loved him. He said, I love you too, Pop Pop, because he had started calling me Pop Pop sometime around his 2nd birthday, and I had never corrected it because it was perfect. Serena barely looked at me. Derek hugged me briefly and said he'd call in the week. I watched the car go down the driveway and turn onto the road and disappear. I went inside and called Frank. I said, It's time. Frank said, I've been ready. Over the next 6 weeks, we moved carefully. I am an engineer. I understand that you do not demolish a load-bearing structure without first understanding what is holding weight and what is decorative. We identified every account Derek had access to 3 of them, totaling just over $400,000, almost all of it money I had accumulated before Serena was ever in the picture. We identified the joint credit account I had added him to in a moment of paternal generosity in 2021. We identified the recurring transfers. Frank drafted the documentation. He brought in a colleague who specialized in grandparents' rights in family law, a woman named Patricia Hendricks, who had 20 years of experience and was, Frank said, entirely without sentimentality, which is what we needed. Patricia reviewed what I had documented about Oliver, the managed access, the way Serena controlled my time with him, a specific incident in the fall, when I had arrived unannounced for Oliver's birthday, and Serena had met me at the door and told me they had plans, though I had confirmed the visit 2 days prior, and Oliver had cried at the window when my car pulled away. Patricia said she had seen worse and won. She told me what to document and when. I spent those 6 weeks behaving normally. This was the hardest part. I made the scheduled visits. I answered Derek's calls, which had become monthly, dutiful, brief. I did not reduce the regular transfers, because I didn't want anything to change in their routine before I was ready. I bought Oliver a wooden train set for his birthday, and mailed it because Serena had made clear that surprise visits were unwelcome. I got a note from Derek, 3 lines, thanking me. Nothing from Oliver, because Oliver was 4. I also started moving. I had a property in the mountains of western North Carolina that Carol and I had bought in 2009. A cabin outside of Brevard, 2 acres, backing up to Pisgah National Forest. We had used it for weekends and summer weeks, and after Carol died, I hadn't been able to go back. The association with her was too strong, but I had kept it maintained, paid a local property management company to check on it, kept the utilities on. I arranged for it to be prepared. New water heater, a thorough clean, enough firewood to last a season. I brought the lavender bowl with me on my first trip up to check on it. I set it on the kitchen windowsill. It looked right there. On a Wednesday morning in early February of 2023, Frank and I executed everything. The accounts Derek had access to removed. His name came off every financial instrument he'd been added to. The recurring transfers stopped. The joint credit line closed. The estate documents revised, with Oliver named as a trust beneficiary with Patricia Hendricks and Frank as co-trustees, which meant Derek and Serena would have no direct control over any inheritance even if the worst happened to me. A new will, drafted to reflect what I actually wanted rather than what I had been gradually pressured into. That afternoon I packed 2 bags. Clothes, my drafting tools, old habit, Carol's photographs, Oliver's drawings from the refrigerator, which I had kept every one of, folded carefully in a manila envelope. The lavender bowl was already at the cabin. I drove out of Greensboro at 4 in the afternoon. I did not leave a note. I did not send a message. I drove west on I-40 and watched the Piedmont flatten into the foothills, and the foothills rise into the mountains, and by 7 o'clock I was on a 2-lane road in Transylvania County, with nothing on either side but dark trees, and I felt something I had not felt in years. I felt like myself. I called no one that night. I made eggs and toast and sat on the cabin porch with a blanket and a glass of bourbon and listened to the creek below the property and thought about Carol, which I do every night, but usually with more pain. That night it was different. She had loved this place. She used to say the mountains made her feel appropriately small. I understood what she meant that night in a way I hadn't before. Derek called the next morning. I watched my phone ring. Then I watched it ring again. Then I listened to the voicemail, which was short and confused. He had tried to access the brokerage account. There seemed to be an issue. Could I call him back? His voice had the quality of a man who suspects something but hasn't yet let himself believe it. I did not call back. Serena called in the afternoon. I did not answer. Her voicemail was longer and had a different quality, entirely less confusion, more steel. She used words like oversight and misunderstanding, and I think there's been some kind of mistake, and the careful control in her voice told me she knew immediately that there had been no mistake. She was already calculating. I called Patricia that evening. She told me that she had filed the initial petition for grandparent visitation rights that morning, as planned, and had included the incident documentation we had compiled over the previous weeks. She said these filings sometimes moved slowly, but that our record was strong. She said to let her handle contact from that point forward. I said I understood. I stayed at the cabin for 3 weeks. I hiked every morning, which I had not done since Carol got sick. I ate real meals instead of the frozen things I had been surviving on in Greensboro. I built a small bookshelf in the second bedroom because it needed one, and because working with my hands has always quieted my head. I read 4 books. I slept 8 hours a night for the first time in years. Frank called in the second week to update me. Derek had retained an attorney, which Frank had expected. Serena's father had apparently also gotten involved. There had been a call from a lawyer in Charlotte who represented his interests, feeling around the edges of the situation. Frank said he had responded firmly and that the Charlotte lawyer had not called back. Frank had a way of being firm that discouraged further conversation. The news about Oliver came in the 4th week, and it was Patricia who delivered it. She had been doing what she did, building the record, talking to people who talked to other people, the patient, invisible work of family law. What she found was not surprising, but it was hard to hear. Oliver was in a preschool program 3 days a week. The teachers liked him. He was bright, social, imaginative, but his parents' relationship had deteriorated noticeably. In the months before my departure, there had been raised voices at drop-off. Oliver had been tearful on multiple mornings. One teacher had noted in a care log that Oliver had said, twice in 1 week, that he wanted to go to Pop-Pop's house. He was 4 years old, and he was asking for me. That was the part that mattered. Not the money, not the accounts, not the house or the renovation. That would never happen. Oliver was asking for me. Patricia filed a motion for temporary visitation, pending the full hearing. The judge in Mecklenburg County was a woman named the Honorable Diane Morales, and Frank told me she had a reputation for reading rooms quickly and for not being impressed by financial leverage. Serena's attorney tried to characterize my disappearance as instability, as evidence of an erratic temperament unsuitable for contact with a minor child. Patricia responded with 4 months of documented, methodical preparation and a financial record showing that what I had done was exercise my lawful control over my own assets. Judge Morales granted temporary visitation within 10 days. I drove down from Brevard on a Thursday morning in March. I want to tell you about that Thursday. Patricia had arranged for the exchange to happen at a neutral location, a family services office in Charlotte, the kind of beige institutional room with soft chairs and a basket of toys in the corner that is designed to feel as unlike a courtroom as possible. I arrived first. I sat in one of the soft chairs and I held my hands together to keep them still, and I thought about Carol, and I thought about the oak tree, and I thought about the truck books and the lavender bowl. Then the door opened. Serena came in first, and she looked at me with an expression I will not try to describe, because there are not adequate words for what happens to a face when rage and control fight each other at close quarters. Her attorney was beside her. Derek was behind them both, and he looked older than I had ever seen him look. He looked like a man who had finally seen what he had been standing in the middle of. And then Oliver came around the side of his mother's leg. He stopped. He looked at me. He had gotten taller in 2 months the way children do at that age. That sudden, improbable growth, and he had Carol's eyes in that light, and he looked at me for 2 seconds that lasted longer than any 2 seconds I can remember. And then he ran. He hit me so hard he nearly knocked me off the chair. He wrapped his arms around my neck and pressed his face into my shoulder, and I felt the whole architecture of myself, every careful, controlled, engineered thing I am, come apart completely. I held my grandson, and I did not try to hold myself together, and I did not care who saw. Patricia gave me and Oliver 45 minutes in a side room with the truck book she had thought to bring. He told me about preschool. He told me about a dog named Captain that lived next door to his house, and that he wanted a dog more than anything in the world. He showed me a loose tooth that he was enormously proud of. He ate 3 crackers from the basket in the corner and asked if Pop-Pop's house had crackers, and I said it had all the crackers he wanted. When the time was up, Patricia came to the door. Oliver hugged me again at the door, and I told him I would see him very soon. He said, "Promise?" I said, "I promise." He went back to his mother. He looked over his shoulder once, at the door. I drove back to Brevard, and I sat on the porch with the bourbon and the blanket, and I told Carol what had happened, out loud, because I do that sometimes when it matters. The full hearing was in April. I drove down and stayed in a hotel, and wore the suit I had worn to Carol's last good event, a dinner in 2016 before things got bad, because it still fit, and because I needed to feel like someone who knew what he was doing. Frank and Patricia had done their work. The financial record was clear. Every dollar I had given was mine to give, mine to stop giving. The access Derek had held was access I had granted and had every right to revoke. The estate changes were legal, thorough, and had been made before any legal action was initiated, which was important. What Serena's attorney could not explain away, and what I think changed the room, was the teacher's log. Oliver, 4 years old, asking for Pop-Pop, twice in 1 week. Children don't perform for care logs. Judge Morales read that entry, and her expression did not change, but something in the room changed with it. Serena's attorney argued that I was using Oliver as leverage in a financial dispute, that my sudden withdrawal of support was coercive, that I was an unstable presence who had disrupted a family unit out of spite. He was skilled at his job, I'll give him that. Patricia's response was 18 pages long and included every documented visit, every transfer, every communication, and the pattern it revealed was not of a father retaliating. It was of a man who had been slowly, carefully excluded from his own family, while being systematically used as a funding source, who had done nothing impulsive or harmful, who had simply stopped. Judge Morales granted me regular visitation every other weekend and 1 extended summer visit, with the provision that further restriction would be reviewed if Oliver's expressed preferences, which she took seriously, continued to indicate distress during separations. She also noted, in language that she directed at Serena and Derek equally, that the financial arrangements between adults in a family had no bearing on the rights of a child to have consistent, loving contact with a grandparent, and that she would be watching this case. I shook Patricia's hand in the hallway. Frank was on the phone but gave me a nod that in 30 years of friendship I had learned to read as significant. Derek was standing by the elevator when I passed. His attorney had already gone. Serena was somewhere behind him. He looked at me, and I stopped, because I could see that he was trying to find something to say, and I owed him the space to find it. He said, "I didn't know it had gotten that far." I said, "I know." He said, "She..." and then he stopped. He looked at the floor. He was 38 years old, and he looked like he was 11 again, and I had found him in the driveway after a bad day at school, sitting in the gravel with his back against the tire of my truck, waiting for someone to notice. I said, "Come see me in Brevard." He looked up. I said, "Bring Oliver. Come see the cabin. There's room." He didn't say anything. I got in the elevator. I don't know what he did after that. 3 weeks later, on a Saturday morning, a car I didn't recognize pulled down the driveway of the cabin. I was on the porch with my coffee. The car stopped and the passenger door opened and Oliver came out at a dead run. I set down my coffee. He hit the porch steps at full speed, and I caught him at the top, and he grabbed my face in both his hands the way he did when he was being serious, and he said, "Pop, Pop, is this your mountain house?" I said yes, it was. He looked around at the trees, at the creek you could hear but not see, at the woodpile, at the dark edge of the Pisgah forest. He said, "I like it." I said I liked it too. Derek got out of the car slowly. He stood by the door for a moment. I watched him look at the cabin, at the porch I had rebuilt, at the window boxes I had planted late in the season just to have something to tend, and I watched something move through his face that I recognized because I had felt it myself. The specific grief of a man who has let too much time pass and is now standing at the edge of what he has lost, calculating whether the distance is still crossable. I raised my hand. He raised his. Oliver grabbed my hand and pulled me toward the porch steps. "Can we go to the creek?" he said. "Dad said there's a creek." I said there was a creek. "Can we find rocks?" I said we could find rocks. He pulled harder. I looked at Derek over Oliver's head. My son was walking toward the porch now, his hands in his jacket pockets, not quite looking at me, the way he had always moved toward things he was nervous about. He had done it the day he told me he was getting married. He had done it the day he called to say Carol was in the hospital for the last time. He came up the steps. We stood next to each other on the porch for a moment, looking at the trees. He said, "The cabin looks good." I said, "It needed some work." He said, "Yeah." Oliver was already at the edge of the yard, pointing at something in the grass. His voice came back to us, high and certain, full of the absolute authority of a 4-year-old who has spotted something interesting. Derek said, "I ended things with Serena." I said nothing. He said, "Or she ended them. Depends on who you ask." He let out a breath that had been held for a long time. "The attorney is in Charlotte. The house has to be sold. Oliver is Patricia helped draft a custody arrangement." I said, "I know. She keeps me informed." He nodded. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I should have." And he stopped, and started again, and stopped again. And I understood that there were years' worth of unfinished sentences between us, and that we had time now to say them, all of them, as many times as we needed. I put my hand on his shoulder, not as comfort, not as forgiveness, not as anything that had a name, just a hand on a shoulder. The way a father does when a son has come back from somewhere difficult, and the right thing is not words. Oliver shouted from the yard that he had found a very large rock and needed immediate assistance evaluating it. Derek almost smiled. We went down the steps together. That afternoon, the 3 of us walked the creek for an hour. Oliver found 17 rocks that he assessed as excellent, and transported them in the front pocket of his sweatshirt until his sweatshirt was almost too heavy to carry. He narrated everything: the water, the birds, the specific qualities of each rock. A spider web he found stretched between 2 branches that he regarded with scientific respect. Derek walked beside me and we talked a little, carefully. The way you talk when you're learning a language again, after years away. I did not ask for an apology. I did not offer one. We were not at the apology yet. We were at the beginning of the road that leads there, which is its own thing, and sometimes the beginning is enough. At the end of the afternoon, when Oliver had fallen asleep on the cabin couch, with his sweatshirt full of rocks on the floor beside him, Derek sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and looked at Carol's lavender bowl on the windowsill. He said, "Is that Mom's?" I said it was. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I miss her." I said, "Me too." Outside the window, the mountains were doing what mountains do in the late light, that slow bronze deepening that Carol used to make me stop and look at even when I was in a hurry. I looked at it now. There was no hurry. There was the creek and the trees and the last of the afternoon, and my son sitting at the table where I had eaten alone for 2 years. I poured another cup of coffee and sat down. We stayed until after dark. What neither of them understood, when all of this began, when Serena looked at me across that dinner table and said I was becoming a problem, when Derek looked down at his plate and let her say it was that I had not spent 64 years building things only to watch them taken apart by people who understood the price of everything and the value of nothing. I had built a business and a house and a marriage and a family, and I knew something about load-bearing structures. I knew which parts could be removed and which parts, if you took them away, would bring the whole thing down. I was the part they had forgotten to calculate, and when I disappeared, they felt the weight of it. But I want to end here, in this kitchen, with the lavender bowl, and the mountain light, and my grandson asleep on the couch, and my son sitting across from me. Because that is where all the engineering was pointing all along, not toward justice, though justice came. Not toward money, though money was the instrument, but toward this. Toward a Thursday morning when a 4-year-old runs up a porch and grabs my face and tells me he likes the mountain house. Toward an afternoon walking a creek and talking about rocks. Toward the particular silence of two people who have hurt each other and survived it and are still, somehow, in the same room. I am Walter Graves. I am 64 years old. I built things my whole life, and I am still building. And I am not done.